everyone, welcome. I think we have about 40 people registered, so I'm just going to get started and welcome you all, but just know that there'll be probably other people coming online as I do this bit, and hopefully are in place by the time Sid starts. So firstly, just a huge welcome to you all to the Childhood and Society Special Interest Group Network that we have here at Middlesex University. I'm absolutely delighted to have Sid present as part of the series today. So the series itself it's hosted by Middlesex, the Centre for Education Research and Scholarship, and I coordinate it, and it's intended to showcase the research, the educational research that we do within and across the education department at Middlesex. It's intended to be a convivial, safe space where we share our ideas and our research at various stages of development, be that from an idea about research, a methodology we're working with, or a theoretical framework, a philosopher, and educational researchers at different stages of their careers. So it's intended to be very inclusive and to be an opportunity for us to share our work across our educational community within our university, but also more broadly so we have a number of external people. Wonderful to see external people here, Barbara and Liz, and I can't see the other names, but welcome to our little community. And I'm not going to take up too much space. Hi, Victoria. I'm not going to take up too much space because I want to allow Sid to have as much time as he needs to have a relaxed approach to presenting his work, which is based upon his PhD. He's currently writing up his thesis, but he's also been incredibly industrious and has 3 publications as he's been working on his PhD thesis as well. And this is his sole authored paper that's I'm delighted as editor of Gender and Education to have it in that journal, and I had no part to play whatsoever in managing that paper. It just went out into the world and was managed by my co-editors. So it's a real achievement to have a publication in that particular journal, which is very high impact and prestigious. So I'm thrilled on so many counts. But Sid is going to be presenting from that paper, which also feeds directly into his PhD research about males in Montessori spaces. I'm not going to say anything more about that because I will ruin the content of his presentation if I tell you any more. So welcome, and if you could just pop yourselves on mute, that would be wonderful. The structure of the session is I stop speaking, I hand over to Sid. He will have 30 to 40 minutes to present his work, and then whatever time we have left will be an opportunity for question, answer, discussion, which I will be fielding and facilitating. So I think we're good to go, Sid. Over to you.
Just share my presentation. A sec. Can everyone hear me well?
Yes, yes.
Great. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to Jane and those at SIRS for this opportunity to share my research. And thanks all for participating in this seminar. So this presentation, as Jane said, is based on my paper that was published in the Gender Education Journal at the beginning of this year. And it is titled Beyond Male Recruitment, Decolonizing Gender Diversification Efforts in the Early Years by Attending to Past-Present Material-Discursive-Affective Entanglements. And I know that's quite a mouthful and a densely packed title, which I hope to unpack in this presentation. What I want to emphasize from the beginning is that whilst this paper is about thinking of gender diversification beyond male recruitment, my intention is by no means to trash the important work that has come before or dismiss the ongoing critical work enacted by feminist and queer theorists on the involvement of men in early years. Historically, the recruitment of men has primarily relied on narratives that frame women, communities of color, and non-heteronormative families as deficit, perceived to lack qualities required to effectively support children in their development, particularly young boys. So this is what has been termed as the recuperative masculinist politics, the idea that positions men as rescuers of a failing educational system. So you see this in the 2017 Early Years Workforce Strategy document that blames the absence of positive male role models and father figures as reasons for boys' underachievement, which really relies on simplistic notions of gender matching identification between children and teachers. And although normalizing men's involvement has the potential to ruffle essentialist understandings of gender, this is not simply realized by recruiting more men into the sector. Instead, adequate gender-sensitive training is required to address the unequal gender power relations in the sector. And whilst I am enormously appreciative of the efforts to welcome more men into the sector, I'm also disturbed and troubled by the increasingly disproportionate emphasis placed on recruitment of men as the sole narrative for gender diversification of the early years workforce. Feminist scholars of color, such as Chandra Mohanty, Sarah Ahmed, Nirmal Puwar, Hazel Karbi, and so forth, have offered some of the most cogent critiques of diversification in workspaces, inviting a consideration of what diversification efforts do by focusing on what they obscure. So what I'm really interested in is, what is concealed, what is hidden and obscured as a result of some stories, narrative becoming too big, that in Haraway's words, that other narratives become unthinkable, not available to think with. So in her book, Space Invaders, Race, Gender, and Bodies Out of Place, Nirmal Puwar argues that diversification is often framed as adding people who look different without addressing how the qualities, principles, structures that those spaces are built upon are inherently cisgender, heterosexual, white, non-disabled, and so forth. And whilst the sector is relentlessly framed as female-dominated, you see that the dominant theories and knowledge frames, that is the theories of European male philosophers, the low pay and status, which is an outcome of women's contribution being historically undervalued, as well as the masculinist neoliberal machinery, kind of reproduce and sustain cis-white heteropatriarchy. And in some ways, you can say that the diversification through male recruitment as a sole narrative results in a sort of change of perception of patriarchy while continuing to reproduce it in imperceptible ways. So in this paper and presentation, I utilized feminist new materialism and post-colonial and decolonial theories to uncover how a fixation on male recruitment reinforces colonialist conceptualizations of gender, sex, but it also obscures how early childhood spaces are imbued with material discursive processes that privilege cis-white heteropatriarchy. I particularly draw from the works of decolonial feminist scholar Maria Laguns and post-colonial feminist scholar Oyeronke Oyewumi, who shed light on the entanglement of colonialism, capitalism, and cis-white heteropatriarchy. That is the idea that capitalism was the incentive behind colonialism, legitimized through racial categorization. But they also show that colonial gender system permeates all domains of colonial and neocolonial life. In this slide, I think it is important to view the imposition of cis male female binary as the dominant sort of gender sex model as a colonialist sort of phenomenon. So if we do not contextualize and historicize gender, we will, in effect, continue to center our analysis on cis-white patriarchy, which is sustained and reproduced by heterosexuality, capitalism, and racial categorizations. So the imposition of colonial gender sex binary system has, in contemporary context, as well as historically, led to the marginalization and criminalization of rich variations of gender sex that were acceptable in pre-colonial societies. These variations have been documented extensively. It's kind of noted some of them here. The two-spirited people in indigenous communities in North America. And then you have the Hijra, Kinar, Tirunangi, and Koti communities in South Asia. The Zapotec, the Muche collective from the Zapotec culture in southern Mexico, the Bansi people in Indonesia, and amongst others. This kind of constitutes what Scott Morgenson refers to as the indigenous possibilities that really threw Western gender sex binaries into question and led to constructions of pre-colonial gender sex expressions as primitive and uncivilized, and thereby framing the cis heterosexual manhood as the pinnacle of human evolution. So by subscribing to Haraway's famous concept, situated knowledges, I resist disembodied notions of seeing and knowing, and instead embrace an embodied objectivity that accounts for a politics of limited location and situated world-making. This enables thinking outside the duality of objectivity and relativism to produce more responsible and careful account of our worlds. So as opposed to seeing the world as discrete entities, that is units plus relations, Haraway teaches us it is relationality all the way down, and that layers are inherited from other layers, temporality, scales of times and space, which don't nest neatly together, but have oddly configured sort of geometries. So these layers really matter when considering my own situatedness as a queer person from South India who lives in the United Kingdom. I believe it is pertinent that the brutal histories that have shaped gender and sex in post-colonial India be addressed to indicate how colonial histories unfold, and materialize in everyday classroom realities. For this, I use Katie King's term past-present, which is a term that is inspired by Haraway's nature culture. It's a valuable concept to make sense of this complex worlding in not only rejecting the linearity of time, but also resisting the notion that of a radical break from the past. So past and present are insoluble, and they perpetually coalesce, co-invent, and reenact worlds. So the encounters shared in this presentation and in the paper must be read through the past presence of coloniality of gender in order to fully appreciate how worlds are materialized in early childhood spaces. So in pre-colonial India, Hijras were a valid and accepted gender category that comprised feminine identifying individuals, most of whom underwent genital reconstruction. Historically, they were perceived as third gender. In contemporary context with globalization, that's a problematic term, and they're depicted historically in historical writings as early as 3rd century CE. In 1871, the British colonial government passed the Criminal Tribes Act 2. To criminalize hijras, and they were deemed as opprobrium to colonial rule and viewed by the British as habitual sodomites, beggars, and obscene presence in public spaces, and the kidnappers and castrators of children. The 1871 law required the police to draw up registered for those who were hijras and prohibit anyone registered from wearing female clothing, adornments, or from performing in public. Moreover, children were removed from houses registered to hijras because they were constructed as sexually deviant pedophiles. The short-term goal of the law was to erase the presence of hijras in the public. The long-term goal was to exterminate the hijra community altogether. The efforts to erase this unclassifiable in-between from public discourse and spaces remain an issue in contemporary Indian context and is no different in the UK. Although there have been concerted efforts to move away from pathologization of gender and sexual variability, trans, non-binary, and intersex communities continue to be subject to various forms of violence, epistemic, medical, as well as physical violence. Intersex children, for instance, whose bodies do not cohere according to cis-centric, sexual dimorphic, and non-disabled conceptualizations of corporeal, chromosomal, and hormonal normativity, endure a non-consensual medical violence. So with the increasing acceptance of trans and non-binary people, there has been, it has attracted a backlash from various groups, particularly trans exclusionary feminist groups that have come to be known by the acronym TERF, T-E-R-F, which means trans exclusionary radical feminists. So the TERF politics fundamentally based on reductive notions of what Oyewumi refers to as biologic or body reasoning, a Western gender categorization that relies exclusively on biological determinism. This does not consider the multifaceted, variable, and sometimes malleable nature of sex. But when we center colonial histories and the coloniality of gender, trans exclusionary politics ceases to be an issue exclusively concerned with gender sex, but it can be viewed as a sustained imposition of whiteness. So as gender variability and resistance to it are becoming more widespread in various public platforms, increasing numbers of trans and non-binary children are finding confidence in making themselves known in the UK context as well as globally. And in this context, it is, to me, disconcerting that the unclassified in-between, namely trans and non-binary and metagender communities, continue to be absent in debates around gender diversification in the earliest workforce. So for me, complicating understandings of gender sex beyond the binary plays a critical role in the efforts to decolonize gender sex in early years to ensure cis-white patriarchy is resisted and dismantled. So even though Western feminism emerged as an Enlightenment modernist project, successive configurations of feminist theory and research, particularly feminist postmodernism and post-structuralism, have railed against the principal tenets of Enlightenment. However, in an attempt to refute the reductive essential of the understandings of materialism as conceived in modernism, feminist post-structuralists and postmodernists have assigned undue importance to text and discourses. And even if you look at the research related to gender diversification in early years workforce, there has been a sort of emphasis on the discursive, which as a result, kind of downplays materiality altogether. Feminist new materialism kind of reattends to materiality as agentic and conceptualizes worlds as produced through material discursive processes instead of framing discourse as acting on inert matter. This aligns with the post-colonial critique that highlights how the failure of anti-realist approaches to account, how they fail to account for materialities. It can serve as it can become an obstacle to anti-racist work, since when you consider race, you have to consider the material forces and realities that shape the experiences of non-white bodies, which becomes erased if we are not looking at the material, aspects that are produced through a Eurocentrification of knowledge, culture, and history. So feminist new materialism complicates understandings of gender, sex, by conceptualizing it as situated in and across bodies, human and non-human. In contrast to views that frame sex as biologically determined, that is, nature, and gender as socially constructed, aka culture, a feminist new materialist ontology accounts for their inseparability. The gender and sex are similar to nature, culture. They're entangled. And this sort of framing, the feminist new materialist framing, views sex and gender as materially, discursively, affectively, and historically produced through situated entanglements. In this research, by adopting an auto/ethnography, I draw from my experience of working as an early childhood educator in a preschool in London. Through the use of the slash, I trouble the humanist notion of a singular, impermeable, and unified self, the auto. Instead frame auto as porous, emerging and re-emerging through more than human temporal relations in the classroom. Moreover, the self and the knowledge generated is viewed as always partial. As Stacey Alamo says, the sense of selfhood is, transformed when we view self as materialized through vast, intraconnected networks that are constantly in flux. And as she says, they can never be entirely mapped or understood or known. So in viewing the self this way, I refuse Enlightenment humanist tropes that position objectivity and subjectivity as opposites. Instead frame the researcher as an ontologically entangled author, enmeshed in knowledge and world-making practices, which Barad's neologism, ethical onto epistemology, succinctly captures. That is a knowing in becoming, that is iteratively and simultaneously producing worlds. Keeping the auto intact is strategic and of significance because of the concerns I share with feminist and post-colonial scholars of how the category of human is being dissolved at a time when many are still struggling to have the humanity recognized. And whilst I frame the auto as porous, such porosity is impeded by the material affective stickiness of race, disability, and sexuality. In fact, in the possibilities to be adequately porous or human enough in post-human times is a privilege of whiteness. Unlike the conventional sort of autoethnographic approaches that rely on reflection and reflexivity, that is, it displaces the same elsewhere, I deploy diffractive methodology. It's a methodology that's inspired by Haraway and Barad. It kind of enacts a diffractive approach where there's a layering of temporalities that is made possible, of bringing together disparate sort of layers from coloniality of gender to contemporary sex gender politics to material discursive encounters, and reading them through each other, thereby producing what Haraway calls another kind of critical consciousness. So in the following slides, I share a few vignettes from the classroom. I recount my experience as a trespasser in a system that is pervasively and invisibly white. I account for how white supremacy already infuses early childhood spaces and shapes the understandings, practices, and experiences of those involved. By focusing on the material semiotics of chairs, child-sized chairs, I hope to make visible the deeply entangled practices of whiteness that unsuspectingly generates the norms and standards in early childhood education. So this is the first encounter. At this Packaway Montessori nursery, the teachers were instructed to be seated at all times, assigned positions corresponding to curriculum to sit and observe children engaging with materials and each other, only intervening when absolutely necessary. Seated on child-sized IKEA chairs, I feel incredible levels of tension in my body. This was not just because of the lower back and hip pain and discomfort induced by sitting on very low chairs, although I later came to know the pain was intensified as a result of osteoarthritis of the hip, but also from having to move, lift, carry heavy furniture in and out of storage every day. So Montessori is often credited for the introduction of child-sized chairs in the early years, informed by data from her anthropometric studies. She had elaborate instructions for her manufacturers on the dimensions and design of her chairs. In mainstream schools at the time, the furniture was heavy, regimented, machine-like structures that were designed to regulate children's bodies. And Montessori refers to these as degrading to the body and spirit. By creating child-sized chairs and furniture, she wished to liberate children from the tyranny of education systems at the time, so children could be autonomous and self-sufficient learners. My own situated becoming with child-sized chairs in this preschool was far from liberating. Sitting on chairs induced lower back pain. It worsened my hip pain. And if you look into the research carried out to account for physical demands on early childhood practitioners, it highlights how sitting on chairs is a key factor contributing to musculoskeletal issues and back injuries. So the practice of sitting on chairs was further accentuated by notions of what effective teaching constituted in Montessori, in that Montessori classroom. According to Montessori, the greatest height of a Montessori teacher's success is to be able to say, now the children are working as if I did not exist. And at this preschool, sitting on chairs was therefore viewed as a sign of success. In other words, not sitting on chairs, or rather getting up from the chairs to intervene, was associated with inefficient practice. If I have to get up and intervene, that means, my classroom isn't, in Montessori term, normalized. So this pressured practitioners to sit longer, and my efforts to inform the senior leadership team about my back and hip pain were met with indifference. I was initially mocked for complaining about pain as a young male, followed by patronizing comments about the sacrifices one must be prepared to make to care for young children. So the othering of disabled bodies is produced through a complex web of technologies that reinforce notions of what constitutes the normative human. The norm of the ideal human of humanism, one can trace back to Da Vinci's 15th century drawing of the Vitruvian Man that frames a cis-white, non-disabled male body, which perfectly fits within a circle, within a perfect circle, as the flawless image of human. Tied to this Vitruvian idol are logics of autonomy, independence, and self-sufficiency, which interestingly were also Montessori's incentive behind the creation of child-sized chairs. And although originally intended for liberation by attending to the situated agencies of child-sized chairs, it is possible to account for how cis-white patriarchy kind of materializes and colonizes everyday early childhood bodies and spaces. As mentioned earlier, capitalism and colonialism have a very entangled history. Capitalism has relied and continues to rely on the oppression and exploitation of post/colonial human and non-human subjects. At this nursery, practitioners and children both sat on IKEA child-sized chairs, and when we look into, the IKEA child-sized chair, you realize that they're products of capitalism produced in the millions, which on entering the early childhood space becomes part of the material discursive technologies and assemblages that produce neoliberal subjects. So following Haraway's invitation to think tentacularly and tracing the journeys of the child-sized IKEA chairs allows for other narratives to emerge that further complicate the status of chairs in EC. IKEA is recognized as the largest consumer of wood in the world, with 21 million cubic meters of logs used every year, which is equivalent to 1 tree per second. The climate justice organization Earthside reports that the chairs sold by IKEA are made from wood that is illegally felled in the forest of Ukraine Carpathians, one of the last remaining habitats for endangered lynx and brown bear populations. The illegally felled and logged wood is then transported to countries in the majority world to manufacture affordable child-sized chairs and furniture. The facade of affordability that IKEA prides in is fabricated through large-scale exploitation of workers in the global majority. Such practices are built upon images of the West as a benevolent capitalist, and thereby concealing the violent histories that were instrumental in producing present-day material conditions, but further obscuring the West's role in sustaining economic disparities and more than human injustices. So the past present of these IKEA chairs in the nursery adds further layers to how gendered, racialized practices besmear, habitual early years encounters. This is the second encounter, second sort of vignette. I'll read it out. The line manager's office was the room adjacent to the classroom. The manager could see the entire classroom from their office. The nursery was deemed outstanding by Ofsted, and as a result, there were enormous levels of pressure placed on educators to perform to the standards set. For instance, the safeguarding policy of the setting necessitated staff to go beyond the standards set by Ofsted. In order to safeguard children and avoid accidents, practitioners had to position themselves in their chairs in such a way that all children were in sight at all times. If the staff sat on chairs with their backs facing a child, the line manager would emerge out of their office to reprimand. We knew we were being watched and scrutinized at all times, some of us more than others. It felt that nothing escaped the notice of the SLT. Our success as practitioners depended on sitting on chairs, facing children, and observing, assessing, and planning incessantly. Such regulatory practices were framed by SLT as training for best practice and with the children's best interest at heart. So at this nursery, chairs were assigned to each practitioners. Practitioners were fixed and anchored in positions that corresponded to curriculum areas to ensure that no area was outside the adult gaze. Children, however, moved across these spaces. The positioning of practitioners in child-sized chairs contributed to being in a state of permanent visibility to the SLT, which assured automatic functioning of power as a means to extract labor. So the design of the SLT office and the classroom was such that the classroom was fully visible from the office, but the office was not visible to those in the classroom. So like the prisoners in Bentham's Panopticon, the practitioners were the, in Foucault's words, objects of information, never subjects in conversation. This panoptic mechanism was further intensified by the fact that the SLT sat in the office on adult-sized chairs, while the practitioners and the children were sitting in child-sized chairs. and as a queer South Asian person who's assigned male, I was made hypervisible through my entanglement with child side chairs. There was a sense of stickiness that was generated through histories of affective intensities that were shaped by the suspicion of queer brown male bodies. Those very same intensities that deemed hijras a threat to young children. These affective intensities produced by sitting on child-sized chairs were further accentuated by the deprofessionalized status of early years practitioners, whose experiences were inflected by matters related to low pay, working conditions, as well as the imposition of new managerialism. So it's important to note that the differentiation of materiality then space is inextricably enmeshed in politics of producing hierarchies and in turn, the circulation of power. So Tema Okun, activist who's written extensively on white supremacist culture and how it emerges in workspaces, highlights how the hoarding of power and paternalism are key features of white supremacist patriarchal culture in workspaces to ensure whiteness is reproduced and sustained. Furthermore, the orientation of child-sized chairs ensures that that children and their movements are ceaselessly being observed, assessed, and fixed. The chair practitioner assemblage manifests as an instrument of gaze, albeit a gaze from above, from nowhere, from simplicity, as Haraway says, a core feature of white masculinist knowledge and world-making practices. The panoptic gaze marks the unmarked and self-invisible position of man and whiteness as objective, the culture of no culture, thus rendering all other positions as subjective, invalid, and thereby without voice or presence. Such a gaze ensures the unremitting production of cis-white patriarchal ways of being in early years. The third vignette, progress is more producing white childhood. So every week we had to produce at least 3 new observations per key child, with the burden to always show progress. The development of each child was color-coded. Red represented lagging behind in development. Green symbolized on par with expected levels of development, and yellow represented the child had exceeded the expected norms. The practitioners were pressured every week to ensure that all children were in the green zone. This was exacerbated by the fact that practitioners were not given sufficient time to do the paperwork, and we were expected to observe, assess, and generate next steps while seated on the chairs assigned to us. At the same time, ensure children were always within sight and that they were safe. So the incentive to produce children in green zones is driven by an obsession with progress, which, according to Tema Okun, again, is rooted in another feature of white supremacist culture. That is the notion that success is synonymous to more without giving consideration to the cost that it entails. And I'm aware of, as someone who is being, who's perceived as cis male sitting, in being entangled with child-sized chairs, I was tasked with the progress of the failing boys, and the notion of the failing boys is informed by data from national statistics and international league tables that depict boys underachieving in comparison to girls, which pro-masculinists, have tapped into these anxieties of perceived threat to boys, framing the times as anti-male and desperately in need of remasculinization. the construction of such an image has generated a moral panic and media scare around stories of boys in crisis, which feminists have highlighted how such understandings of progress and failure are construed and constructed through a singular focus on gender without accounting for the influence of, for example, class, race, location, and so forth.
Sid, can I just jump in? You have 5 minutes.
Okay, sure. So returning to the child-sized chairs, it is important to note that the proportions of the chairs were originally designed by Montessori for Western children and universalized in non-Western contexts. The children were measured every day through the use of anthropometric instrument called the pedometer, and biographical records were produced for each child. These measurements in turn inform the dimensions of the child-sized chairs globally. I'll move on to the next. Oops, sorry. So the image of progress, or the lack thereof, is fabricated through processes of datafication and inspection, which is engineered and driven by white masculinist discourses that construct children as competitors in the global economic race. In England, this datafication of progress is based on the development matters and developmental perspectives that frame children's development as linear and singular, and children as knowable and fixable. There's this work by Mindy Blaze that asserts how the developmentalist conceptualizations are entangled with colonialist understandings of childhood generated through theories of European philosophers. Anyway, I mean, while I was trawling through historical photos of early Montessori classrooms, I came across a 1928 image from Germany where chairs were arranged on top of tables oriented variously to produce an obstacle course. And children are seen in this image climbing, crawling, and standing on chairs. The following week, along with another practitioners, and children at the preschool, we created our own obstacle course in the garden with child-sized chairs. The obstacle course was produced in myriad configurations: upright, sideways, downward facing, stacked up, and so forth. And I joined the children as they climbed, crawled, and jumped. And some children even rode their bikes on it. But becoming with child-sized chairs, narrated in the previous, sections, had left feelings of trauma and anxiety that had considerably limited corporeal capacities, and it evoked feelings of being fixed, regulated, and disciplined and punished. So by reattending to child-sized chair through a playful encounter narrated above, it kind of opened up, albeit playfully, the potentialities of what child-sized chair, could be made possible. So here's a poem that I've written, which I'll read out. Chairs, chase, chairing, goose chair, childcare, others beware, sticky despair, colonial impair, sit, observe, be observed, or else face the scare. Stop the incessant stare, expose the hidden snares. It's time to declare that which is not yet there. Chairs, chase, chairing. What else do chairs do besides the imperial screw? What roles do they render in this post-human debut? Stand, climb, be climbed on, resist the same old view, defy the rules, disassemble, rearrange them askew, topple them down and start afresh, for this serious play is long overdue. So as a queer, non-binary, disabled South Asian early childhood practitioner / researcher, the playful becoming with child-sized chairs offered momentary possibilities and intensities of subversion, liberation, and pleasure. And it is an act of an onto-epistemological defiance for me. So contrary to the presumptuous sort of claims of recuperative masculine interventions, such encounters and events enlarge the capacity and offer modest possibilities of partial recuperation and care. With that, I will end. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sid. Perfectly on time. What an amazing journey you've just taken us on. That was so rich and so diffractive. We went in so many different spaces, places, and really provoked thinking in ways that are really, not simple or straightforward, but really provocative. And I thank you for that. I mean, I have many questions, but that's not my that's not my prerogative to take up space in Q&A to then have them all to myself. I noticed there was one from Nathan. Nathan, do you want to pose your question directly, or would you like me to do it?
No, I can do it. Thanks, Sid. Look, really fascinating and informative. You know, I've seen some of your postings on Facebook and Twitter about these kind of issues, and so but before I'd never even thought about it. So great presentation, and I'm going to email you, and you can tell me how to do these fancy backgrounds on your PowerPoints as well. All right. My question is part informed by my own academic interest and part from being a father, right? And so when you had the slide about the progress and about that kind of intense regulatory gaze, okay, and that need to be working out every day or every week or whatever it is, where children sit on this green, red, yellow kind of spectrum. I'm just wondering, obviously the kind of performative pressures of the industry and so on, and keeping up to your Ofsted judgments and these kind of things obviously play a role, and those kind of narratives shape how the authorities do. But I'm just wondering, I suppose this is, A, are parents aware that this is going off? B, do parents expect it? Okay. And so how do they relate to this kind of regulatory gaze? Because, you know, my daughter went to nursery from 9 months old, and okay, it's nice to see that you see every now and again that they're making progress. That's not my primary goal, and I'd be worried about getting all these and feeling like my 12-month-old child or a 2-year-old child is being monitored and assessed on a daily basis. You know, maybe that fits quite well with then entering the school system, but you know, I would be uncomfortable as a parent from that. So I was just wondering whether you had any sense for how involved parents were with these kind of things.
Involved parents were in
yeah, whether they're aware that this monitoring is going off, whether they're eager, whether they're demanding that to be going off.
There was definitely a mixture. I mean, there is that pressure for their children to fall within the normative development, and why isn't my child writing? Why isn't my child being able to say their phonics? You know, that those kind of pressures are there. And I think a way of response for me has always been a both and approach rather than an either or approach. You know, how can we work with it? How can we stay, with the trouble and be responsive to parents and address their anxieties at the same time, subvert and resist and offer alternative narratives from the nursery that enable them to see differently. Does that?
Yeah, thanks. It's interesting. I suspected there might be something of the demand coming.
Yeah.
It may be, yeah. I don't want to speculate too much, but that's enlightening. Thank you, Sid.
Thanks for that, Nathan. Victoria, you have a question about the cruelty of colonial practice for India's hijras. Do you want to pose that directly to Sid?
Sure, yes, thank you, Sid. I'm so glad you ended on serious play poetry. It's very important for academics not to just use lots of hard words and theories, but actually sort of throw themselves into the creative as you did. So I think it's a lovely gesture towards a different perspective on this quite constrained situation. And that's the reason I wanted to ask about the Hijiras, because I know you dealt with it quite briefly, but I've always been fascinated by persons in communities and cultures that operate as a kind of at a tangent, that operate on the margins, and yet are accepted into the culture as that fringe, rather like the Latar in Indonesia, where they might say the things that no one else dares to say within the community. And I just wondered about, for me, it started because I was really struck by your using it. I started thinking about it as a model. How does the performative work for Hijiras? Is there a sense in which you feel you use that model because there's a performative sense to your enactment as a teacher with early years children? That's really what my question's around, you know, about those entanglements, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting in India. The queer gay subjectivities entangled with Hijra subjectivities. So when I was growing up, those same sort of practices of mocking Hijras were used against gay and bisexual and other queer people, and then that involved certain gestures and certain ways of clapping and all of that. So that it is an entangled sort of histories of oppression, if you like. But in terms of using that performativity, it's not something I've explored personally. If that's what you meant.
Yes, I sort of suddenly felt it turned full circle at your poem. You know, so that was a little performance, which was also actually, I don't know if this is how the Hijra work, but was actually quite demonstrative. It was in your face. It was we have to change, and so that sense of trans people in the community as being on the margins and yet as operating quite powerfully there.
Yeah.
You know, I really like that image.
I hadn't thought of it that way, but now that you say it, I can see that.
Good.
So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a couple of comments and questions about the kind of physicality or the chair as matter and the political work that it does, and how utterly seemingly benign but utterly controversial and problematic small chairs are. And Lena has reported that despite years of campaigning to have them removed, she was utterly unsuccessful and they remained in situ. And earlier on, Angela asked a question. I'm just presenting these because we're running out of time, about the chair as matter and its uncomfortableness and what that does. So, and this layering of gazes and powers embedded into dominant norms used as a means to other. So I suppose, what's being picked up is how matter matters, and that's essentially what your research is about. So when you take this kind of diffractive, materialized figuration approach to early childhood research, how does that become intelligible to those who are working with different frames of analysis or sense making? So how else might I suppose it's how do you make those connections? How do you follow the knots and make the connections that mean that we have this really nuanced and very political narrative account of what chairs are and what chairs do, specifically in relation to gender in early childhood spaces?
I don't think I understood that, Jane. Sorry.
A bit long and waffling, wasn't it? But yeah, no, it was just about how matter matters and how you make matter matter in your research. So, how do you ensure that people people who are maybe not as well versed in feminist new materialism as you are recognize what the work is that you're doing through this particular methodological, epistemological approach?
Yeah, I mean, within Montessori, what I've really found helpful is to touch on things where Montessori herself, kind of highlight some of these aspects that are that kind of coincide and align with new materialism and post-human theory. So using that as a springboard, like for instance, we have the cosmic education, which aligns with new materialism and post-human theories, and using that as a springboard, as a place of contact for them to connect, I think it's a useful way. But when you look into Montessori's earlier writings, you also see her framing the material as agentic and having agentic capacities to transform the classroom, even though it's still positioned from a very humanist perspective. I think it is using those places of connection and contact to expand perceptions is a useful way, which I found it useful.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think we could probably follow this line of questioning endlessly, almost. Like how do you make? And I think the act of rebellion with the chairs at the end is just such a powerful and beautiful example of how playfully but seriously, those things can be disrupted and other political messages find expression in surprising ways, in unanticipated ways. We've kind of run out of time now, and I just want to thank you, just a heartfelt thank you. It's difficult presenting your work when it's so nuanced and so beautifully theorized. It's not easy to convey those ideas particularly to people who maybe aren't working with the same frameworks. I think you did a fantastic job. I just wanted to say there may well be questions that people still have. So would you be happy to receive them by email?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, maybe we can pop your email address in the chat. And then finally, just to say, for those interested in engaging in the paper itself, it's available at Gender and Education Journal, which our university subscribes to. Middlesex University subscribes to that. And if you don't have access to that journal, either myself or Sid can make the paper available to you. So just get in touch with either one of us. So thank you all so much for coming along and for participating, and just a huge thank you to Sid. It was a fantastic presentation, really well done. And I'll be posting news about subsequent seminars in the series in due course, so just watch our website. Thank you all so much, everyone.